Well, good morning. You beat me to it. Good job. And good morning to those of you tuning in live from home as well. We're glad you are with us digitally, if not physically. So, you know this concept of a Minnesota goodbye? You've heard of this? Actually, it can be broadened to a Midwestern goodbye, really. Look at this very scientific, completely scientific, 100% scientific image that shows the average goodbye time by state. So I don't know if you can read the fine print there, but notice we are the epicenter of the longest goodbye in the Midwest. Over 60 minutes, the average goodbye in Minnesota. I mean, we're envisioning here like if you're visiting someone's home, the amount of time it takes you to disengage and actually leave in your car. So I read one article, another writer that articulated the 9 steps of a Minnesota goodbye, or in this case, a Midwestern goodbye. You'll recognize some of these. Notice, number 1, the very important whelp. The beginning of every good old Midwestern goodbye starts with the stand and whelp. This means you know you have to leave. Now, we mean you stand up and say, whelp, right? You know this. This means you know you have to leave, but you're not getting out of there anytime soon. The whelp only functions as a signal for others that you must begin the process of leaving. Right? And then step 2, the hugs. 3, the walk to the door. 4, the doorway chat. 5, the we really should be going. 6, the second round of hugs. 7, the hand on the doorknob. 8, the slow open conversation as you walk down the driveway. And 9, the window wave. Now, they actually are missing one. Someone corrects this with step 10. We'll get to that a little later. Okay, but what's going on with this? Like, why? Why? Why the Minnesota goodbye? What is this functioning? How is this functioning? Well, I think it's functioning as a way to reinforce significance in relationship and friendship. Right? The function of a long, drawn-out goodbye is to extend courtesy and to show that you value the other person. Like other cultures have developed more efficient ways of conveying and strengthening a relationship, but it is what it is. And I think this is what the Minnesota goodbye is doing. Now, as we come to the ending of Paul's letter of 1 Corinthians, and actually as we look at the goodbye section of other letters of Paul, I think sometimes we see him doing something similar. He doesn't just sign off and say, okay, that's it from me, Paul. Oftentimes there's an extended, lengthy goodbye section, sometimes like a whole long chapter where Paul's doing a bunch of things, greeting certain people by name, praying for them, reminding them of things, giving them different exhortations. And I think Paul is doing this because he's not only interested in conveying information, but he is interested in developing and strengthening the relationship between him and whatever church he is writing to. And so today, as we begin looking at the first large section of Paul's goodbye here, if you will, in 1 Corinthians, he really does linger. And I think what he's doing in Corinth is trying to strengthen and massage this relationship, especially in the context of tension. Like as we've seen, if you've been around here in this letter, there is tremendous tension between Paul and this church. And Paul is aware of this surely as he's signing off. And so I think he's doing what he can to lay here a foundation to strengthen this relationship. And so as we look at really a grab bag of a variety of different things that Paul is going to say to the Corinthians here today, it's kind of hard to know how do we bring all this together, but I think we can bring it together as ways and as an example of how Paul sought to maintain friendships even in the context of difficult relationships. Because look, in any church, we're going to step on each other's toes. We're going to have bumps and bruises. There'll be misunderstanding, offense, witting or unwitting, right? So none of that is unsurprising. None of that is a surprise to us because we're full of people as a church and as churches. So the question becomes, how do we maintain our relationships and friendships in Christian unity despite these things? And here I think we have Paul giving us such a model. So in this passage, we'll see 5 contrasts that Paul will seem to negotiate or advocate as a way to maintain and strengthen relationships in the church, even in the context of tension. So hopefully you got a bulletin when you came in here today. That'll be of some help to you as you follow along. Those of you at home, you can download the bulletin insert there, and we can look at it together. So today we are going to look at 1 Corinthians 16, 5 to 18. really the biggest chunk of Paul's goodbye section in 1 Corinthians, and we will wrap it up next week. Okay, so here's the 5 contrasts. The first of the 5 contrasts we'll explore on the basis of what Paul says here today. Number 1, friendship, not frustration. Like, this church has really frustrated Paul, right? But he goes to great lengths to reinforce the friendship that he sees at play between him and the Corinthians. So look at verse 5 on your outline. Paul writes this. After I go through Macedonia, I will come to you, for I will be going through Macedonia. Perhaps I'll stay with you for a while, or even spend the winter, so that you can help me on my journey wherever I go. So Paul says, I'm going to come visit you. I'm going to go through Macedonia. I didn't put a map up here. Imagine I'm standing right in the middle of the kind of Western Mediterranean. Paul's over here in Ephesus, and there's this big sea that goes up like this. The Corinthians are over here. Macedonia is up north. This is his churches of like Philippi and Thessalonica. He says, well, I'm going to come visit you guys down here, but I'm going to go this route up here through Macedonia. I'm going to come visit you. He will perhaps stay with them or spend the winter, he says. The winter was the season where you couldn't travel by sea in the Mediterranean. There were storms, but it also tended to be overcast and gloomy, so you had a lot of trouble navigating on the sea. So during winter, you couldn't travel a whole lot. So Paul says, well, I hope to come through Macedonia, and maybe I'll even spend the whole winter with you guys. And look what he says here at the last bit of verse 6. So that you can help me on my journey wherever I go. This looks like a little peace offering that Paul is giving to the Corinthians in a strange sort of way. You might remember back in chapter 9, Paul spent like a whole chapter trying to explain the reason why he had refused to accept financial support from the Corinthians. They had tried to pay him. They had tried to support Paul financially when he was among them, but Paul wanted to make clear he was not doing what he was doing for money. He didn't want to come under any undue influence because he kind of knew how the Corinthians were. So he said, no, I'm not going to take any of your money. And this offended them. This troubled them. This bothered them. And Paul devoted a whole chapter in this letter trying to explain how, yes, this was his right as a minister of the gospel, but he gave it up so that he could serve the gospel better. Well, what's he say now? He says, well, you know what, guys? You can perhaps help me on my way. So this looks like a peace offering on this issue. He says, Corinthians, yes, in fact, I would welcome your financial support, not so much for himself, but to fund the next stage of his visit. So we see some gentleness here. We see him walking back a little bit. We see him being a bit gracious and flexible even on this issue. Look at verse 7. He explains a bit. He says, for I do not want to see you now and make only a passing visit. I hope to spend some time with you if the Lord permits. But I will stay on at Ephesus until Pentecost, because a great door for effective work is open to me, and there are many who oppose me. We see here he's writing from Ephesus. This is how we know that. And look, he says, maybe I'll stay here until Pentecost. Now, in an amazing coincidence, guess when Pentecost is? Straight up, literally today. All right, Pentecost is sort of the Jewish festival 50 days after Easter. And this was the day that in Christian circles and traditions we remember as the outpouring of the Spirit. And for Paul's purposes here, this kind of marked the end of spring and the beginning of the travel season. So we know Paul is writing this letter in early spring. He says, well, hopefully I will stay here until Pentecost. Verse 9, because a great door for effective work is open to me, there are many who oppose me. He says, look, there's good stuff going on here in Ephesus. I have a good ministry, and there's many who oppose me. Now, in a roundabout sort of way, we'd think, well, it's time to get out of Ephesus. Paul's logic is exactly opposite. He's like, no, there's lots of people who oppose me. This is good. I'm going to stay on here. A lot of good stuff's going on. Now, notice his little line there in verse 7. He qualifies his travel plans with this. I hope to spend time with you if the Lord permits. So this is a commendable tagline to add on in all of our planning, because we never know, right? And actually, Paul has used language like this already in the same letter when he's talked about this visit he was hoping to make. So look at the screen back from chapter 4 where he's really threatening this visit. Back in chapter 4 of 1 Corinthians, look what he says. He says, some of you have become arrogant as if I were not coming to you. But I will come to you very soon if the Lord is willing. And then I will find out not only how these arrogant people are talking, but what power they have. For the kingdom of God is not a matter of talk, but of power. What do you prefer? Shall I come to you with a rod of discipline, or shall I come in love and with a gentle spirit? So Paul says, I'm going to come to you, Corinthians, if the Lord wills, after going through Macedonia. Now, interestingly, the Lord did not will, okay? And Paul ends up doing the exact opposite of what he's planning on here. Okay, instead of going up through Macedonia like he said he was going to, something made him in first switch his travel plans completely and go to Corinth first. In 2 Corinthians, he talks about this and calls it the painful visit. He goes to Corinth and it is an absolute debacle. There's one individual in the congregation that has really rebelled against Paul. Things come to a head. They go face to face. It's an absolute disaster. And Paul heads up north back to Macedonia, and later we read about this in 2 Corinthians. Okay, so notice here in the dynamics of this first century church, we have all sorts of misunderstood motives, judgment, conflict, disagreement. And do you ever see these things happening in churches? Nod your heads like this. Of course. Why? Because churches are full of us. Yes, us humans, right? So I take some comfort that we see these dysfunctional dynamics right here, squarely in the first century church, under the leadership of an apostle. Okay, so we're not surprised if we see these things in our lives as well. So the great question is not going to be whether dynamics like this will hit us, but rather what do we do under them and in the midst of them? That's the question. And we'll see Paul tries very hard to maintain the relationship in a good way between him and the Corinthians. As we'll talk about it later, he fails. All right, things go from bad to worse. But in the end, it's okay. It's a happy ending in the end. Look at part 2, the second contrast that we can see Paul advocating here. Welcome, not resistance. Look at verse 10. When Timothy comes, see to it that he has nothing to fear while he is with you, for he is carrying on the work of the Lord just as I am. No one then should treat him with contempt. Send him on his way in peace, so that he may return to me. I'm expecting him along with the brothers. So here's Paul's sort of right-hand man at this stage of his ministry, his special associate, his special representative that he sends out to hot spots, named Timothy. Now, already, again, in the same letter of 1 Corinthians, Paul has already talked about the fact that he has sent Timothy. And so by the time this letter is written, Timothy's already on his way. But Paul's not sure quite when Timothy's going to arrive. Like, there's no texting. He doesn't know. But he expects this letter to arrive apparently before Timothy does. And look what Paul has said earlier in this letter about this dispatching of Timothy to them. Again, back in chapter 4 in the context of discussion of significant conflict. I urge you to imitate me, Paul writes. Look at the screen. For this reason I have sent to you Timothy, my son, whom I love, who is faithful in the Lord. He will remind you of my way of life in Christ Jesus, which agrees with what I teach everywhere in every church. So remember, this letter is written to a church in crisis. Okay, this church is on the verge of turning against Paul. And part of Paul's answer is to dispatch Timothy. Paul says back in chapter 4, Timothy is going to remind them of Paul's way of life. So Timothy is coming as Paul's representative. He's coming with some kind of critique to remind them of the example that Paul wants them to follow. So what is Paul worried about what might happen when Timothy arrives? Are they going to like everything Timothy is going to say? Notice he's concerned about the welcome and the reception that Timothy is going to get. So he urges them to receive him well. They are to honor Timothy. They are to listen to him. So here we see the kind of mutual respect and honoring that Paul expects us to show in the church. Now, we have no explicit word of how this visit of Timothy turns out. However, reading between the lines, we can probably say it was kind of a disaster. So remember, something happens that makes Paul completely change his travel plans. He was going to go up through Macedonia, visit Philippi and Thessalonica, then comes to Corinth. But something happens that makes him change plans completely and make a beeline straight for Corinth. Now, we don't know what it was, but very plausibly, it is precisely this visit by Timothy. Timothy shows up. Plausibly, things are way worse than they even realized. Timothy sends this message to Paul. Paul changes his plans and goes right to Corinth, and then it's the explosive blow-up of what Paul calls the painful visit. And he writes 2 Corinthians afterwards, trying to explain and defend himself against the Corinthians who have challenged his motives, called him dishonest, in part because of all of these changing travel plans. So it's interesting, for all Paul's attempts here to maintain things, it just goes from bad to worse, and you can see it play out in 2 Corinthians. Look at part 3, the third contrast Paul lays out here. Cooperation, not competition. Look at verse 12. It says, now about our brother Apollos. I strongly urged him to go to you with the brothers. He was quite unwilling to go now, but he will go when he has the opportunity. Now, it's sort of hidden, I think. We'd easily pass over this, but this is one of the most remarkable, beautiful little verses and sections in the whole letter of 1 Corinthians. I mean, this really is something. If you were here with us like a million years ago when we were going through the first part of the book of 1 Corinthians, you might remember the first issue that Paul dealt with them on was this issue of factions in the church, right? They had split up under the allegiance of various Christian leaders. Some were like, well, I follow Peter. Others were like, I follow Paul. Others were saying, I follow Apollos, right? So they had divided themselves up under various Christian preachers and leaders that had been involved in the orbit of 1 Corinthians, and they were kind of at each other's throats over this. Now, it's interesting, if you go back and look at that whole section, guess what name appears the most? Apollos. Okay? So it really seems like the issue of Apollos versus Paul was the key issue in terms of what was going on. And look, we understand why the Corinthians and what they valued would really love Apollos. We know about Apollos. He's from Alexandria, okay? Alexandria was renowned for its teachings of philosophy and oratory. We know Apollos was a skilled speaker and teacher. And remember, the Corinthians really valued that culturally. They loved oratory. They loved persuasive, impressive speech. And so it seems they were really taken by Apollos, okay? They really liked him. Look what Paul's written back earlier in 1 Corinthians, back in chapter 3, in the midst of that snarly discussion. What after all, look on the screen, what after all is Apollos? And what is Paul? Only servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. The one who plants and the one who waters have one purpose, and they will each be rewarded according to their own labor. For we are co-workers in God's service. You are God's field, God's building. So then no more boasting about human leaders. All things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the present or the future, all are yours, and you are of Christ, and Christ is of God. So do the Corinthians really want Timothy to come visit? Who do they want to come visit? Apollos. What Paul has said here, look how he intros verse 12. Now, about our brother Apollos. That seems to be indicating this is a response to something they've written him. So they have probably requested that Paul send Apollos. Who is Paul sent instead? Timothy. Okay, but look how interesting. Look at verse 12 again. About our brother Apollos, I strongly urged him to go to you with the brothers. So notice, what does Paul do? It'd be very tempting for Paul to do everything he could to try to keep Apollos away from this church, right? Because he knows Apollos, is a sense, in the Corinthian mind at least, is a major competitor to Paul. But notice he doesn't do everything he can to keep Apollos away from the church. What does he say he did? I really tried to persuade Apollos to go to you. This shows that Paul does not blame Apollos for what is going on in Corinth. This probably had nothing to do with Apollos himself as such. This was the Corinthian response to them. But what does Apollos do in this verse? What did he do? He said, no way. Now, we're not told why, but plausibly it's for the same reason that Paul doesn't send him. Apollos is canny enough to realize and recognize the tensions in Corinth, and he recognizes it's only going to get worse if he goes there. So Apollos himself might have been absolutely horrified at what was going on in Corinth and what was being done in his name. So he says, nope, not going to do it. But just notice how we see a beautiful example here of non-competitiveness and cooperativeness and generosity and grace in terms of Paul and Apollos and how they're working together relative to the church in Corinth. So here's Paul really putting his money where his mouth is when he talked about unity and working together and we're just servants and neither one is anything. He says, I tried to get Apollo to go to you guys, but he was not willing. He knew what was up, probably. Okay, look at part 4. Another contrast here. Love, not immaturity. Verse 13. Here's just Paul often does this in his goodbye section. He'll just sort of rip loose with a bunch of short little commands, exhortations. Be on your guard. Stand firm in the faith. Be courageous. Be strong. Do everything in love. Now, we could do a whole message on just that verse. I mean, there's a lot there. Look at the first part of it. Be on your guard. This is one of my favorite Bible words because the Greek word here is gregoreo. What's that sound like? Yes. This is the word that my name comes from, the name Gregory. So I like this. This is good. This is one of my favorite verses. It means to be watchful, be on guard. So Paul says you must be on guard. You must be watchful. Against what? Against what sorts of things? Well, all sorts of spiritual threats, right? Different types of temptations, different types of sin. Paul says, look, we must be on guard. We must be watchful because we are in a dangerous situation. Makes me think of somewhere along the line, a number of years ago, I was working through a DVD series that was training like tactical use of a handgun or whatever. And I remember one of the things they had everybody do is that they made you practice was after you go ahead and shoot and you're about to holster the pistol, you bring the gun in and they forced you to look that way and look that way and then you can holster your pistol. Why'd they make you do that? To see if there's any threats, right? Because there's this idea, I don't know if you've experienced this, called target fixation. If there is some threat to your safety, it's almost like a tunnel vision thing that you just lock onto that and the rest of the world around you just fades away. So forcing yourself to physically do this is hopefully conditioning a person to try to break out of that in the context of danger. This is what Paul's saying. We must be on guard. We must be watchful. We must be alert to all sorts of spiritual dangers and threats. Look what he says next. Be courageous. Be strong. Literally, Paul says, act like a man, which in the culture was said to convey this idea of courage, but it also had this contrast of maturity versus immaturity. So kids, you've heard this to be brave or to be courageous. Does that mean we're not afraid? Sometimes people think, well, if we're brave, it must mean we're not afraid. But notice it's possible to be brave even if we're afraid. Okay, so a couple nights, night before last, we had a youth group lock-in here. And so one of the things we did was we played this game called Sardines. Anybody do this? For hours we played this, okay? The lights are off in this entire church building. It's like midnight. The lights are all off. One person hides in some obscure corner of this building, and everyone else scatters around in the complete darkness and tries to find them. And I will tell you, you have not experienced this church building unless you have experienced it in the complete darkness, going room to room, closet to closet, feeling for people. All right? It's an experience. So I think Micah Tinquist and I, we came together as these groups are morphing and fading, and so we were going through some dark room, and we started talking about being afraid of the dark, and I was like, yeah, I'm afraid of the dark. Absolutely. And he's like, well, it's not that we're afraid of the dark. We're afraid of what's in the dark. I'm like, yes, I know, right? So notice you can be afraid of something, but still be brave if you continue in that fear. And I said to Micah, yeah, for some reason, I'm not scared of the dark if I'm with somebody. So Micah was with me, so I felt safe. If I was by myself, I could be scared of the dark. But notice the point is, to be brave or courageous doesn't mean we're not afraid. It means we keep going despite that fear. Notice what Paul says here at the end of that line, do everything in love. Okay, there's just a wonderful catch-all, a wonderful exhortation to the core Christian ethic of love. Do everything in love. And if you think of the incredible dysfunction of the Corinthian church, if they had just followed this exhortation, if they had done everything in love, man, they would have been spared all of this. They wouldn't have had the factionalism, right? They wouldn't have had the selfishness of the people that were prideful and thought they have knowledge. There wouldn't have been the abuse of people at the Lord's Supper, of the poor. There wouldn't have been the misapplication of spiritual gifts. There wouldn't be this combative situation with Paul. Like if they had just practiced this, all of that could have been avoided. Do everything in love. So look at this. This is a great sort of tagline for Christian ethics, and it reminds me of a famous saying of a Christian leader back in the 4th century named Augustine. He had a sermon. What's it called? Put it on the screen here. He gave a sermon back in the 300s on 1 John 4:4-12. And look what he said. Here's a famous line. He said this: "Once and for all, I give you this one short command. Love and do what you will." In the sense of do whatever you want. He says, love and do whatever you want. Now, it'd be possible to take that out of context and misapply it, but notice there's some real wisdom to this. If this is the central Christian ethic and moral guidance, there is this sense we could say, look, if we are loving, we can do whatever we want. Because every Christian ethical decision would fall under this category of love. And again, we could take that out of context and misunderstand, but notice what a great guide that is. Love, and figure out the rest of it as you go. Now, I just happened to be browsing through another one of these books this week on near-death experiences. This one written by a pastor who researched this and collected these and put them together. And he had a fascinating chapter in this book on what he called the life review. And here's a theme that people have reported as they have come back from near-death experiences of encountering God and being walked through what is called a life review. And it's probably the sort of thing you've heard. And they said oftentimes this has been introed with this line: let us have a look at what you have done with the life I have given you. And the person is walked through sometimes moment by moment, thought by thought, act by act, even stuff they'd forgotten of their whole life. And what's interesting, he made this observation, that the emphasis in this life review seems to have to do with treatment of other people. The focus has seemed to be in these life review experiences most about how has the person interacted with others. Look how you said that thing there. Look how you hurt that person. Wow, look how you helped that person, encouraged them, right? Now, near-death experiences we can take with a grain of salt because we don't know for sure if that's real, legitimate, or whatnot. But notice that suggestion has an immediate plausibility as Christians. It has an immediate plausibility that a life review could be based on how we have treated others. Why? What did Jesus say when someone asked him what's the most important commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then Jesus said, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. So there's a plausible possibility, right, that this is something that will be heavily weighted by God in terms of how we have treated one for another. And oftentimes people come back from this experience with a renewed desire and a joy in serving and loving other people. So oftentimes it's a very fruitful experience, but we don't want to have to go through the trauma of a near-death experience. So let's conduct our own little mini life review for a moment, shall we? Let's just think back to the last week. All right, just think back over the last week. How'd you treat people this week? Were we impatient? Were we short with anybody? Did we get into an argument? That's not so bad. How did we argue? There's the more pressing question. What did we leave undone this week out of service to others? These are deeply painful questions to me, probably you as well. There's some value in running through this under this rubric of do everything in love. Well, look at part 5. Another contrast that we can see Paul laying out here. Respect, not rebellion. Verse 15. You know that the household of Stephanas were the first converts in Achaia. So Achaia was like the region that Corinth was in. So he's talking about a family from Corinth here. You know that the household of Stephanas were the first converts in Achaia, and they have devoted themselves to the service of the Lord's people. I urge you, brothers and sisters, to submit to such people and to everyone who joins in the work and labors at it. I was glad when Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus arrived, because they have supplied what was lacking from you, for they refreshed my spirit and yours also. Such men deserve recognition. So who are these people? Notice these are some of the first converts to Christ in Corinth. So here's some of the first believers in the city of Corinth. And notice Paul says they have devoted themselves to the service of the Lord's people. So here's a man in a household in some sense involved in service to the Lord. So it appears that Stephanas is one of the leaders in the church in Corinth. And particularly, he's one of the leaders that has remained loyal to Paul through all this. And what do you think? And notice he says they've come to Paul. Stephanas has come to Paul in Ephesus and these other two guys. What do you think they have brought to Paul with them? We've seen part of what Paul's doing in 1 Corinthians is responding to a letter the Corinthians have written. So what do you think they were carrying? They were probably carrying this letter. And Paul is now writing this letter we call 1 Corinthians. How do you think that letter is going to get back to Corinth? These guys are probably going to carry it back. Now, are the Corinthians going to just love and applaud everything that Paul tells them in this letter? No. In fact, we know they don't respond to it so great. So Paul, just kind of like with Timothy, is concerned about how Stephanas is going to be received. He knows Stephanas is going to go back, probably as a leader in the church that's been kind of loyal to Paul. He's going to be carrying this letter that could ruffle some feathers. And so Paul takes this opportunity to put a little endorsement here, just a little sort of note of recommendation that you guys need to listen to Stephanas. You need to respect him. You need to honor him. Look at verse 17. I was glad when Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus arrived because they supplied what was lacking from you. Okay, at the same time, I think Paul's being very gracious and kind here to the Corinthians. What does he mean when he says they supplied what was lacking from you? Okay, I don't think he's talking about them bringing him anything. He's not talking about them bringing any money. I think what he means is they supplied what was lacking in the sense of what was Paul really missing when he thought about the Corinthians? He really missed them. Like he really, despite the dysfunction, he really loved these people. And so he seems he's being just kind and gracious and saying, look, when Stephanas came, it was like finally I was complete. It was like I was back in Corinth again. We were united again. So it just seems to be a gracious way of him saying, hey, when Stephanas and the others came, it was like we'd been reunited again. And remember, he is saying he's hoping to come to them. He wants to see them again because he does dearly love them. Okay, so bottom line, how do we summarize the perhaps teaching of this passage? Hard to do. I laid all this out. I'm like, how do you bring all this together? How do you summarize all of this? But it does seem to me, kind of everything we looked at here does seem to be Paul sort of massaging and protecting and trying to preserve and build up the unity that he has with the Corinthians despite these challenges and tensions and disagreements. So let's put it this way. Practice Christian community despite dysfunction. Practice Christian community despite dysfunction. So notice Christian community is a value for Paul. All right, we are brought into the family of God, the household of God. This is to be a community. And notice this is something that we practice, all right? It can't be accidental. It must be something we value. We must place ourselves within the community of God's people. But look, I suggest that we do this despite what? Dysfunction. And look, this will be all over the place, of course, in our circles, just like it was in the first century church of Corinth. But despite that, this is something that we must value and devote ourselves to if we are followers of Jesus. So here's 3 suggestions for you. First, by expecting all kinds of misunderstanding, tension, and conflict. Let's not act surprised. Okay, this is a normal part of broken existence. All right, and we can all have the best intentions and still get cross-threaded with each other very easily, right? So let's not let that surprise us. Second, by realizing community can be most divine when most difficult. I read this, elders were reading this book called Retro Christianity, and the author has this great line where this beautiful couple pages where he talks about community, and he talked about the awkwardness in Christian circles of sometimes being forced into a community group where like people are different and it feels awkward and we just don't get along great. And he contrasts this with how nice when we're with real like-minded people and we understand each other and we value the same things and we all get along. And he's like, that's the real community, right? And then he suggests, no, in fact, the opposite. He suggests the real Christian community is the awkward one, the uncomfortable one. Why? Because we can all get along with people that like us and we get along with easily. Just like Jesus said, don't only do good to those who are good to you, right? Even the sinners do that, right? So there's this idea that in Christian community, I think the most authentic community animated by the Spirit is going to be in those contexts when it's most difficult. So let's not let that overly trouble us. Third, by following Augustine, love and do what you will. So again, that's a little dangerous tagline because we need to understand what Augustine really means by love. He doesn't just mean be nice to people and do whatever you want. If that's what he meant, our culture would love that. But rightly understood, here's a great guide, right? Love and do what you want. Highlighting the central Christian ethic of love in the sense of putting others before ourselves. Let's stand together and sing a closing song. So here in the first chunk of Paul's long goodbye to the Corinthians, we sort of see 5 contrasts that we see Paul exhorting or laying out in the face of the tension that he knows exists between him and the Corinthians. Part 1, friendship, not frustration. Like Paul could have just thrown up his hands with the Corinthian church, but no, he values their friendship. He really wants to come and see them. Part 2, welcome, not resistance. He says, look, I've sent Timothy to you. You need to welcome him. You need to listen to him. Don't treat him with contempt, even if he's saying things you don't like. Part 3, cooperation, not competition. Here we see Paul and Apollos, must have been rolling their eyes together in Ephesus, being like, oh my goodness. But on the same page, not taking advantage of the situation against one another. 4, love, not immaturity. As Paul says, be strong, be courageous, do everything in love. And here's an approach that would have spared and protected the Corinthians from so much. And finally, part 5, respect, not rebellion, as Paul endorses Stephanus, who's going to bring this potentially feather-ruffling letter back to the Corinthians. And we said, bottom line, practice Christian community despite dysfunction. And look, again, we know, despite Paul's efforts, things really went from bad to worse in Corinth, right? This letter does not fully have its intended effect. Timothy probably goes, reports back to Paul. It's bad news. Paul changes his plans. He goes to Corinth. It's explosive, confrontational. He leaves. He calls that the painful visit. He writes a letter to the Corinthian church, which has been lost. He gets a report from Titus about what's going on. He writes the letter we call 2 Corinthians, and it's a mix of encouragement and discouragement, as now there's outside elements in 2 Corinthians, and the church has turned against Paul even worse. And yet, we know that in the end, Paul's efforts actually here do pay off. And there is a happy ending in Paul's relationship with the Corinthian church. How do we know this? 2 reasons. First one is, what do we have in our Bibles? God's word. Yes. You're absolutely right. And interestingly, what's that part of God's word that we've been looking at today and could see in the letter after it? Notice we have these letters, 1st and 2 Corinthians, preserved for us. Now, if the church in Corinth went completely off the rails, maybe those letters would still be preserved. But their preservation does seem to be a sign that in the end, they in fact came around. Also, we know that the Corinthian church in the end remained faithful to Paul and to the gospel because of a little letter called 1 Clement. It's part of the Apostolic Fathers. And it's a letter written by Clement, the Bishop of Rome, late in the 1st century, like around the year 96 or something. So notice it's 40 years after Paul writes this letter. And the Corinthian church has its own issues again, but Clement is able to write to Corinth and praise their faith and their faithfulness and say, everyone knows you are the faithful church of Corinth. So we see from Clement's letter that these tensions eventually did get resolved, and the Corinthian church did remain faithful to Paul, their founding apostle, and the Christian gospel. So that's good news. We like a happy ending. Speaking of happy endings, Minnesota goodbyes. Not everyone loves Minnesota goodbyes. So notice this public service exhortation from someone that wants to do away with them on the screen. You might not be able to read the small print. Here's what it says. Every year in Minnesota, thousands of people try to say goodbye only to be thwarted by an additional half hour of standing there talking about nothing. Together we can end this madness. Together we can get in our cars and on with our lives. Together we can win. No more Minnesota goodbyes. Okay? Now, I read other people that added additional layers to the Minnesota goodbye, and I think that first article I referenced missed a crucial step. So notice, let's modify our 9 steps of a Minnesota goodbye and add the critical last step. Someone yells, "Watch out for deer." Okay? After the window wave, that's when you yell, "Let's watch for deer." Now, I also watched a short documentary from about 20 years ago put out by PBS that was coaching newcomers to Minnesota through various parts of Minnesota life. And on their segment on the Minnesota goodbye, they also added an important level of nuance and perspective to step 1, the whelp. And they said, look, this initial triggering of the goodbye needs to be addressed to someone in your own party. You know, you don't stand up and say, "Whelp," to your host. You turn to someone who's there with you and say, Welp, we should probably get going. It's one less step of confrontation. You just direct it to someone who's with you. So why are these goodbyes so long? Again, I think whether wittingly or unwittingly, this tradition is developed as a way to convey value, respect, and friendship to the other person. And here, of course, is what we see, I think, Paul trying to do is he takes a longish sort of goodbye at the end of this letter that he writes. Welp, we should probably get going. So watch for deer.